Most people think that the Bible starts with a simple story. God created the world, made man, placed him in Eden, and everything followed from that point. However, when we examine the text carefully, we notice that immediately after Genesis 1:1, something unusual occurs. The sacred text explains that God created the heavens and the earth, and then it tells us that the earth was shapeless and void. This detail does not appear normal. Why would a perfect creation begin in a state of confusion and darkness? Was the earth in that condition from the very start, or did an event take place between one verse and the next? This seeming gap between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 might be hiding one of the Bible's greatest puzzles. Let's analyze this matter further. The phrase, "the earth was shapeless and void," might seem straightforward, but it holds a much deeper meaning. In the original Hebrew, the words used are tohu vabohu, which suggests something chaotic and desolate, as if it had been devastated. In other words, we are not discussing raw material being formed. We are referring to something that had already been ruined. The idea that God would create something from a state of chaos challenges the usual logic of divine perfection. Many scholars therefore conclude that this disorder was not the start of creation, but the aftermath of an earlier destruction. Something significant happened that left the earth unrecognizable. This reasoning is known as the gap theory. The gap theory proposes that there was an era before Adam, one that the scriptures hint at but do not fully explain. During this period before Adam and Eve, the planet already existed, possibly inhabited by spiritual beings, or even by some unknown form of life. Yet something occurred, a rebellion, a judgment, or a cosmic event of great magnitude that devastated this earlier creation. What we read in Genesis 1:2 would then be the result of a ruined world on the verge of being restored by God. In this context, the creation of Adam would mark a new phase rather than the absolute beginning of everything. The Bible itself offers clues that something momentous occurred before the creation of man. In Job 38, God challenges Job by asking, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding, who determined its measurements?" Here, we see that conscious beings, referred to as the sons of God, were already present during the foundation of the earth. This suggests that an earlier heavenly order existed along with the formation of the physical world. These sons of God are frequently understood to be angels or celestial beings. If they were present before Adam's creation, what were their roles, and why has this earlier existence been forgotten? To better understand this mystery, we must also consider the biblical accounts of Lucifer's fall in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28. These passages describe an exalted celestial figure who was full of wisdom and splendor, but rebelled against God out of pride. This figure, known as the morning star, boldly proclaimed in his heart, "I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will be like the Most High." This rebellion is described not as occurring after man's creation, but in a time that precedes it. This observation supports the idea that an active spiritual existence existed before Eden, and that this rebellion had major consequences for the cosmos, including the earth. If this fall took place before Genesis 1:2, then the chaotic condition of the earth may be seen as a result of that event. God's judgment on Lucifer's rebellion might have led to destruction so severe that the earth was thrown into disorder, shapeless and void, covered by darkness. This explanation clarifies why the creation account from verse 3 onward appears more like a restoration rather than an original creation. In this view, God was not starting from nothing, but was organizing a world that had already been marred by corruption. This reading changes our understanding of the beginning of the Bible by showing that much more was at work behind the scenes than we might assume at first glance. The command, "Let there be light," would then not mark the start of creation, but rather the start of restoring a shaken world. This interpretation fits with the nature of God, who continually brings order to what has been damaged. It is interesting to note that the sun, moon, and stars appear only on the fourth day. So what was that first light? Many believe that it was the light of God's presence emerging over a dark, fragmented world. This light did not appear solely to illuminate the scene. It also declared that God's plan was still in progress, even after the destruction. This teaching reveals something significant about the character of the Creator. There are also non-biblical indications that support this theory, including archaeological findings such as unexplained megalithic structures and fossils of creatures that do not fit the post-Adamic narrative. All of these points contribute to the possibility that a pre-human era existed that was both unknown and mysterious. Some scholars propose that science and faith are not in conflict, but that science might be noticing remnants of this earlier creation. What we call ancient mysteries could be just fragments of a world that existed between the first two verses of the Bible, a world that was wiped away, or more accurately, judged before the new beginning with Adam. This understanding also helps explain why the enemy appears active in the opening chapters of Genesis. In Genesis 3, the serpent tempts Eve in the garden. But where did the serpent come from? When did it fall? And why was it already operating with such craftiness? If Lucifer's fall had happened after Adam's creation, it would have required an incredibly short period for such corruption to take hold. However, if the celestial rebellion took place before the creation of Adam, as the gap theory suggests, then everything fits together. The serpent was already an ancient adversary, experienced in its ways, with a plan that had started long before humanity existed. There is also an interesting detail in the Hebrew of Genesis 1:2 regarding the term translated as darkness. The Hebrew word chose does not simply mean the absence of light, but refers to a deep, dense spiritual obscurity. In several other biblical passages, this word is associated with judgment, with the presence of evil, and with separation from God's glory. This leads us to understand that the darkness in that verse was not purely physical, it was also spiritual. The planet was not just dark, it was marked by spiritual contamination, suggesting an event of cosmic proportions. The creation did not begin with light, it began in a state of ruin. Throughout Scripture, when Israel falls, God sends prophets. When the temple is destroyed, God declares that it will be rebuilt. And when humanity strays, God offers redemption. This pattern shows that God's nature is to start fresh, where there has been destruction. Genesis 1:3 can be read from this perspective as God's declaration, "Let there be light," which serves as an order of restoration and a message of hope over a hurting world. This viewpoint entirely changes the tone of the narrative. It is not just a poetic description of creation, but rather an announcement that God's plan is now underway after a primeval fall. Now comes the most intriguing aspect. If there was an earlier creation, who was part of it? Who lived on the earth before man? Some suggest that those beings were purely spiritual, while others propose that there might have been a pre-Adam race connected to the sons of God, mentioned in various biblical texts. There are even those who believe that the famous giants in Genesis 6:4, called the Nephilim, could be descendants of beings from that earlier era. These ideas are theories, yet they are all rooted in biblical texts and patterns pointing toward one reality. They suggest that there are more mysteries in both heaven and on earth than traditional theology often acknowledges. One aspect that cannot be ignored is the connection between the deep mentioned in Genesis 1:2 and other biblical texts. The Hebrew word used there is tehom, which describes chaotic, watery depths that are linked to judgment and spiritual confinement. For instance, in Revelation 23, the deep is identified as the place where Satan will be restrained for 1,000 years. This connection implies that the deep is not simply a location, but a dimension related to divine punishment. So when Genesis tells us that darkness covered the face of the deep, it is more than just a poetic detail. It is a clue that the earth was enveloped by a dark, condemned presence. With that in mind, we can picture the earth not as a blank canvas, emerging from nothing, but as a post-conflict scene, a ravaged planet lacking light and burdened by judgment. This view is consistent with the narrative of Lucifer's fall and the expulsion of the rebellious angels from heaven, as described in Jude 1:6. It raises the possibility that part of the punishment for these beings took place in that deep where darkness reigned. Everything appears to point in the same direction. The earth described in Genesis 1:2 is not an untouched slate, but a place marked by judgment, a cosmic battleground that was destroyed by divine justice and now awaits restoration. The creation of man then represents a new beginning, a new lineage, and a new narrative with its own purpose. When God said, "Let us make man in our image," he was not only creating, but also establishing a new spiritual order over a world that had been deeply affected by earlier events. This interpretation does not lessen the value of the creation account in Genesis. Rather, it expands our understanding. It shows us that God's plan stretches beyond a simple beginning, revealing that before our time there were celestial events of both light and darkness, rebellions, judgments, and a world cloaked in darkness until God's voice spoke, "Let there be light." That light was not only physical, it was a powerful declaration of authority, power, and mercy. Even after everything that had happened, God chose this planet to continue his narrative with us. This new start on earth is filled with symbolism. Every act of creation, dividing the waters, forming the light, and bringing forth life, is an act of restoration, a divine response to the earlier chaos. God is not only organizing the physical elements, he is also confirming his authority over everything that had been disturbed. It is as if, day after day, God was declaring that disorder would not have the final word. Every detail in this creation account stands as evidence that God's plan is capable of rebuilding what appears to be irreparably lost. Yet, this process of restoration does not occur in isolation. The presence of evil did not vanish with the creation of man. On the contrary, it reappeared in the garden in the form of the serpent. This shows that the adversary was not entirely eliminated by the earlier judgment, but was confined to a limited influence over the new creation. This observation reinforces the idea that Genesis is not solely a story about origins. It is also a narrative about spiritual conflict. Man was brought into a setting that was already a battleground, and Eden was more than a paradise. It was a stage for an ongoing struggle against an ancient evil. This perspective gives us new insight into humanity's role in the creation story. We were not placed on this earth simply to care for it or populate it. Instead, we were inserted into a spiritual context that has been active long before our arrival. We are part of a plan that aims to restore order in the midst of chaos. God created us in his image, granted us authority, and positioned us as his representatives in a world marked by spiritual warfare. When we see it this way, we understand that our choices, attitudes, and faith are far from insignificant. They contribute to a story that began long before we existed and involves dimensions that our eyes cannot see, but are real. That is why studying Genesis 1:2 is more than a matter of theological curiosity. It connects us with the beginning of the battle between light and darkness. It shows us that the universe has already experienced events of great magnitude and still carries the marks of that ancient conflict. Every time darkness is overcome by light, every new beginning that God allows in our lives, it echoes this pattern. Chaos never wins when God decides to act. If he was able to restore a ruined planet, imagine what he can do in your personal life. Nothing is truly lost when God chooses to start afresh. There is another aspect often overlooked. The Bible intentionally remains silent about the exact details of this interval. This silence does not mean there is no information. Rather, it invites us to seek understanding in God's wisdom. Clues are scattered throughout various books such as Job, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jude, and Revelation. When these pieces come together, they form an unexpected picture of what might have happened before Adam's creation. It is as if the Holy Spirit intended for those with genuine curiosity to look beyond the surface and discover the secrets hidden since the world's foundation. The explanation is not missing, it is coded in the text. For example, in 2 Peter 3:5-7, there is a reference to an ancient world that was destroyed by water. Many see this as a metaphor for Noah's flood, but some scholars suggest it parallels the judgment that took place before Genesis 1:3. The text speaks of heavens that existed long ago and of an earth formed out of water that was later demolished. This raises the question, was Peter referring to a catastrophe that occurred before Noah's flood, a divine judgment that fits exactly between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2? If that is the case, it adds another important piece to this spiritual puzzle. Similarly, Jude, the brother of James, mentions angels who left their assigned positions and were cast into darkness that is reserved for judgment. This description fits with the idea of a rebellion that occurred before the creation of man. These beings are not merely angels who fell during human history. They are figures involved in an act that is much older and more severe. According to the text, their punishment was carried out immediately, and they remain confined in eternal chains. This indicates that some spiritual beings were locked away long before human civilization began, which strengthens the theory that something major happened prior to Adam and Eve. This understanding broadens our view of humanity's role in God's eternal plan. God did not create man solely to live on the earth. He created man to represent justice, obedience, and his own image in a world that had already experienced a severe downfall. Humanity is a living response to that earlier rebellion, a sign that creation can indeed live in partnership with the Creator even after earlier failures. This perspective changes the focus of the book of Genesis from simply explaining physical origins to telling an epic narrative of spiritual redemption. We are here to take on a role once occupied by corrupted beings and to make a difference. This redemptive purpose of humanity also explains the strong spiritual opposition we have faced since Eden. The serpent does not appear by chance, nor does it tempt man randomly. There is a larger reason why Adam and Eve were created to rule over an earth that had already been a stage for rebellion, unsettling those who once had authority there. The temptation is not merely a test. It is a deliberate challenge to a divine project that aims to restore creation through humanity. The enemy is aware of this and works to undermine the plan right from the beginning. Understanding the period before Adam helps us see why the spiritual battle is still so fierce today. There is something even more significant. When God created man, he did more than form him from dust. He breathed life into his nostrils. This act set man apart from all previous creations. No other being, not even the celestial ones, experienced this intimate connection with God. While angels were created to serve, man was designed to form a relationship with God, a role that naturally invites rivalry and spiritual opposition. The new creation not only occupies physical space, but also carries a divine identity. This context helps us understand why the plan of redemption was already in place before the foundation of the world, as expressed in Revelation 13:8. God knew what had happened even before man's creation and still gave man free will. True love is not forced, it is given freely. By giving man the choice to obey, God demonstrated that his plan was not only to restore what was ruined, but also to overcome the past through love and willing cooperation. This shows us a creator who restarts with purpose, depth, and hope. All of this leads us to an important conclusion. The Bible does not simply open with "once upon a time," but with a scenario of conflict, rebuilding, and mission. Eden is indeed a sacred place, but it is also the center of spiritual operations. Man was placed there not just to tend the garden, but to serve a spiritual and strategic role. When man failed, it resulted in a second major collapse of creation. Yet God already had a plan and did not abandon the story of the Bible. Therefore, the narrative is not about a creation that went wrong, but about a creator who always continues to restore. The fall of man was not an unexpected accident. It was part of a larger reality that includes free choices, spiritual battles, and cycles of rebellion and restoration. When Adam and Eve sinned, it did not catch God by surprise. He had already set the stage for redemption. Genesis 3:15 stands as the first promise that the offspring of the woman would crush the serpent's head. This message is not only about the future, it reminds us that evil will not prevail. It also shows that God had decided to send a Redeemer long before the creation of the world and before any fall occurred. This Redeemer, Jesus Christ, is described as the Lamb who was sacrificed even before creation began. This means that the plan for redemption existed prior to Eden, before Adam, and before the earth was filled with life again. This makes us wonder, if God had everything planned from the start, why did he continue with creation? The answer is that he wanted to fully display his love not only for man, but for the entire universe. Ephesians 3:10 tells us that through the church, the many facets of God's wisdom would be made known even to the powers in the heavenly regions. In other words, the plan of redemption is a message meant for all worlds, not just our own. This may be the most significant message hidden between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. The silence in that passage is not empty. It is filled with history, a history that begins with a glorious creation, moves through a tragic rebellion, and concludes with a hopeful restart. It is a history that speaks of angels, of falls, of judgment, and also of light, redemption, and purpose. What might seem like an interval of verses may actually represent an entire era that has been lost to our sight, but recorded in celestial memory. Perhaps one day, God will make all of that known to us. For now, the clues are sufficient to show that the creation of Adam was not the very start, but a continuation of God's plan, a response to chaos, a burst of light in darkness, and a fresh beginning for the earth and its inhabitants. This changes our perspective. We are not merely creatures living on any planet. We are part of a grand reconstruction effort. We are called to live correctly in a world that has already been disfigured. We are part of the eternal plan of a God who turns ruins into restoration. And if nothing in our lives is accidental, then there is a reason you are here today. If there is one lesson to take away from this theory, it is that God does not abandon what he created. Even after the rebellion in heaven or the fall of powerful angels, he still chose to restore everything. This establishes a pattern where, even though sin is widespread, grace is even more abundant. Where destruction occurs, God offers rebuilding. Where darkness prevails, he commands, "Let there be light." This account is not just an ancient story. It is a picture of God's heart, showing a creator who never gives up on his creation, even when it appears irreparably damaged, and that includes you. To truly understand all of this, one must look beyond the surface. The Bible is a living work filled with layers, and if we read it merely as a historical record, we miss the details that point to something much greater. Genesis is not only an explanation of the world's origin, it is the start of a spiritual conflict, a cosmic mission, and an eternal plan. It is a complex and mysterious introduction that presents a God who works both within time and beyond it, who writes narratives with both light and darkness, falls and restoration, silence and truth. It is up to us to seek that wisdom with wonder and respect. That is why many mysteries remain hidden, not because God hides them for mischief, but because he wants his people to search and ask questions. As Proverbs 25:2 says, "It is the glory of God to conceal a matter. To search out a matter is the glory of kings." There is honor in asking questions and purpose in seeking understanding. When you study Genesis and begin to see past the obvious, you join in a spiritual inquiry, a sacred investigation. Perhaps, as you progress, you will realize that many answers are not found in books or traditions, but in a close relationship with the Holy Spirit, who guides us into every truth. Therefore, the pause between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 should not be ignored. It should be examined carefully because it carries lessons that can change our understanding of faith. It shows that we are not the first to fall. We can be the first to overcome. It explains that our struggle is not merely against other people, but against ancient forces that once challenged heaven. It reminds us that even when faced with chaos, God is able to rebuild everything, even your life, your family, and your purpose. The same God who commanded, "Let there be light," over a ruined world, still speaks that command over injured hearts today. Perhaps this is one of the most important messages at the beginning of the Bible. God is an expert at restoring, turning destruction into purpose, ruin into new beginnings, and darkness into light. The creation of man was not a mistake. It was a declaration that God's love is not daunted by past failures, and that He is capable of starting over as many times as needed until His will is fulfilled. This truth encourages us to look at our own stories with fresh eyes. Maybe you are also experiencing your own version of Genesis 1:2, a time of confusion, emptiness, and darkness. But God is still speaking, "Let there be light." When He speaks, everything changes. The light appears, order is restored, and the Spirit hovers over the chaos to begin something new. This is exactly how God acts. He does not wait for perfect conditions. He creates the conditions while in the midst of despair. It was so with the earth, so with humanity, and so with each one of us. The same God who restored an entire planet can restore a broken heart. The silence between two verses might tell a story of pain, but it can also mark the start of a process of recovery. The question then is not just what happened on earth before Genesis 1:2, but also what is going on within us now. Is there confusion, darkness, or a past that seems unrepairable? Know that this does not intimidate the Creator. He has already handled heavenly rebellions, ruined worlds, and broken systems, and yet He chose to rebuild. He can do the same for you. What the gap theory shows is more than old details. It conveys an everlasting message. God restores that which is broken, and He does so in a grand manner. When we look at the world today, a world filled with conflict, confusion, and spiritual imbalance, we see that the same pattern continues. The earth of Genesis 1:2 still resonates in our time. The good news remains that the God of Genesis 1:3 continues to say, "Let there be light." He is still working to rebuild, heal, and intervene. One day, just as He restored the earth in the beginning, He will completely restore all things, new heavens, a new earth, and a renewed Eden, without darkness, without falls, and without interruptions. Until then, our mission is to remain steady in that light, even when the world around us seems shapeless and void. You are not here by accident. The same God who chose to rebuild the earth would have abandoned it, yet He did not. He saw worth in restarting, and if He valued a world covered in darkness, then imagine how much value He places on you. Maybe you are currently in a time of silence, between chaos and rebuilding, in your own version of verse 2. But the story does not end there. God's voice still echoes. There is still light waiting to emerge, and you are an important part of that plan. Your existence is a divine reaction to a troubled past. Stand up no matter how dark your situation appears. The Creator is still excellent at turning darkness into a powerful message. He has done this before with the earth, with the heavens, and throughout human history, and He will do it again in your life. The pause between the verses is merely the moment before the light, the instant before a miracle. And when God decides to act, nothing remains unchanged. May this understanding awaken in you confidence, courage, and hope. Because the same God who once declared, "Let there be light," over a ruined world, is the one who today whispers, "Start again," into your heart. If this message has touched you, do not keep this truth to yourself. Share this message, comment on what you have learned, and continue to follow the wonders of God's kingdom. May the Lord bless you, strengthen you, and help you keep your eyes lifted each day, for the heavens are still speaking, and God continues to work.